take a look at the second epilogue of the book of Judges. And I think we want to approach these last two chapters, Judges 19 to 21, with some caution and also some patience. So we're going to take a look at the story in just a minute, but I want us to do a little preparatory work. On the surface, the second epilogue is a dark and violent story, which seemingly involves everything that like a modern movie would involve. Whatever you're looking for that's bad is in this movie, right? There's violence, there's civil war, there's rape, there's abduction, there's jealousy, there's cowardice. It's all kind of spread throughout the story. The real question, I think, is, does the story have sort of a deeper meaning or significance? And I think the answer to that question is yes. So what I want to suggest, and I'll try to work on this as we go along, I want to suggest to you that the second epilogue of the book of Judges is something of a parable. It's not just a story about people engaged in really awful behavior, although that certainly is part of it. I want to suggest to you that this last epilogue is actually something of a parable or an allegory of Israel's relationship with God. Now, to kind of maybe set the stage for that, I want us to look just briefly at an actual parable that deals with Israel's relationship with God. I think this is a really appropriate parable. This is the parable of the tenants in Matthew 21. So here it is. It's nice because it's pretty brief. It's Matthew 21, 33 and following. Here then, another parable, Jesus says. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. Now, here's what we just want to remember, right? That one of the predominant images or metaphors for Israel in the Old Testament is the vineyard of the Lord. This is a parable about a vineyard, which means the vineyard actually is Israel. And we'll see what happens. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. So the tenants lease the vineyard. Part of the rent is paid in some of the grape harvest goes to the owner, and then they keep part of it. And so the owner sends his servants to get his share of the harvest. And the tenants took his servants and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants, more than the first, and they did the same to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance." And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What therefore will the owner of the vineyard comes? What will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him fruit in their season." So notice what the parable is sort of saying here, right? That the vineyard is Israel, and the servant sent to collect the owner's share of the fruit, in effect, are the prophets, who are sent and sent and sent and sent, and they're beaten, a couple killed, some stoned, thrown into the vineyard, ill-treated, in other words, not listened to. Finally, God's last act, God's sort of final act of mercy, is to send his own son. And the tenants see the son coming, and they say, "Let's kill him." And then the vineyard will belong to us. It'll be our vineyard. We'll be in charge. Let's kill it. And so they do. That is, the parable, right, is on the surface a story about sort of agriculture in first century Palestine. But underneath, it's a parable about Israel's relationship with God. And so I think that's the proper way to read this last epilogue of the book of Judges. So what we'll do is, I'm going to read to you most of chapter 19, and then say a few things about it. It'll help you kind of get the storyline down. And then I'll stop and say a few things, and then we'll go into chapter 20. Yeah, Ben? Right. Yeah. What they seem to want, well, they kind of want two things, right? At one level, they want the vineyard or the land to control themselves. I think at a sort of another level, right? And what the parable is suggesting is they want a covenant. They want a covenant like on their own terms. Like, we don't like the terms of the covenant you've given us, so we're going to renegotiate it, which obviously you can't do, right? So here's what happens in Judges 19. And notice here, it's a story about a Levite. Remember we saw last time, right? We had a story about a Levite who seemed to represent Israel, consecrated to the service of God, but he kind of like ruined his ministry and went off and became kind of a paid priest at this like pagan shrine. So we're meant to kind of keep that in mind. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, exactly where our last Levite was, and that's another clue, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine, and this is really important, the English Standard Version has, his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house. Another possible translation is not that she was unfaithful, and his concubine was angry with him, and she went away with him to her father's house. Obviously, those are two very different translations. The ESV translates it as unfaithful. The New Revised Standard Version has angry. I actually think angry is probably better here, and so that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to read it as. So the concubine is angry with the Levite. She leaves him to go back to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there for 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And the father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day, they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the two of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he rose up early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines." And so they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold, now as the day is waned toward the evening, please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to a close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry, and tomorrow you shall rise early in the morning to your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. And when they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over. And the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." When the master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah. And he said to his young men, come, let us go and draw near to one of those places, and spend the night at Gibeah or at Ramah. So they passed on and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned there and went to spend the night in Gibeah. And they went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. So let's stop there and just kind of see what's going on in the story. Now, I think one way of kind of reading this story is that in this story, once again, the Levite is a representative of Israel. The concubine is a representative of God. So notice what happens. The concubine leaves her husband because she's angry with him. She goes to his father's house. The Levite comes looking for her, and the father-in-law offers the Levite hospitality. Stay, stay, stay. Here's your welcome. Here's your welcome. And notice here that it's significant that the hospitality rite is offered, and then we get to the fifth day, and this is when the Levite finally decides he's absolutely leaving. That is, I think one of the things the story is intending to convey to us right here is that what's being offered to Israel is God's welcome and God's hospitality if she repents. But that's exactly what she refuses to do. She decides to go her own way and follow her own program. This is what I want to do. And so off we go. So there they are, they're traveling, they're going back home. And the day's drawing to an end. And so they need to find some place to stay. And they're traveling by Jerusalem, which is not yet part of Israel's control. It's not Israel's capital yet. It's in Jebusite territory. And the servant of the Levite says, why don't we stop there in Jerusalem? It's a big city. They've got really nice hotels. I hear there's a great Four Seasons we can check into. Let's do that. And the Levite says, oh, no. We can't stop there. That's foreign territory. That's Jebusite country. I want to stop among Israelites. So they arrive at Gibeah. They arrive at the town square. And what they're clearly wanting, right, is you show up at the town square, right, and that's kind of where you hope to find maybe somebody who will take you in for the night, because unfortunately, right, there are no hotels in Gibeah. There's not even like a Motel 6. That's how backward the place is. Now, here's where things get really interesting, starting at Judges 19:16. There they are. In the town square, kind of unsuccessfully waiting for someone to offer them hospitality, and then this happens. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim. That is, he's not a native to this part of the country. And he was sojourning in Gibeah. So really important note there, right? This old man's been out in the field. He's not a native. He's not from that country. He's sojourning in this place that belongs to the Benjaminites. And of course, we just want to remember here, right, back from our study of the books of Exodus and Leviticus, remember the three kinds of people in Israel who are especially protected by the law of Moses. Widows, orphans, and sojourners. The weakest people in society, right? They are deserving of special protection. So this man's a sojourner. He is not in his native country. He's kind of weak here and open to difficulty. And so he's the one who offers them to stay with him that night. The men of the place were Benjaminites, and he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going? And where do you come from?" And he said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem to Judah, to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I am going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. So notice this. The Levite has insisted on stopping in Israelite territory, believing that he's going to be well treated. They've been standing in the square. No one has offered them hospitality. Only this sojourner, who's not a local, he's the one who ends up offering them hospitality. We have straw feed for our donkeys and bread and wine, and me and your female servant and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything. And the old man said, peace be to you. I will care for your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square. So he brought him to his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. So hospitality, welcome, important note, right? From a sojourner, not a native. Okay, this is where things are kind of getting kind of unusual. This tells you something really odd's about to happen, and sure enough, it does. So here's what happens in 1922. This is the difficult part. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door, and they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. More about that in a minute. And the man and master of the house went out to them and said to them, no, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do to them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. But the men would not listen to him. So they seized the concubine, and he made her go out to them. So he seized the concubine and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And at the dawn, as dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was until it was light. So this is one of the dark parts of the story. So some of you will remember, right, that this sounds a little bit like Genesis 19, the city of Sodom, and that's intentional. So here's what happens. The Levite and his concubine have been taken in by this sojourner. The men of the city, who are Israelites, whom the Levite thinks are like, since they're one of us, I'll be well treated. The men of this city show up and demand to do exactly what the men of Sodom wanted to do to Lot and his family. That is, what they're proposing is nothing less than gang rape. Now remember, right, we've got two issues going on here, right? We've got, first of all, what they're wanting to do is clearly wrong. But notice also, right, they are attacking one of the most vulnerable and one of the most protected people under the law of Moses, a sojourner. I think what we're getting here, right, is we're getting a story that's intended to graphically illustrate how low Israel has sunk. Here we have a story that illustrates, right, a flagrant, either ignorance of or violation of the law of Moses. And here we have a story that illustrates, right, that in effect, these people, who are supposedly Israelites, are really no different than the inhabitants of the city of Sodom. That's where things are at this moment. Now, the story gets actually worse, if you can believe it. And here it is, in 1927. And our master rose up in the morning, and he opened the doors of the house and went out on his way, and behold, there was his concubine lying at the door of the house, with her hands on the threshold. And he said to her, get up, let us get going. But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey And the man rose up and went his way to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb in 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened, or has been from the day that the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." So notice what's happened now here. Thing number one, the Levite, faced with this kind of mob that's converging on him and wants to do him harm, takes his concubine and basically pushes her out into this mob and says, "Take her instead." And so they do. In the morning, he opens the door, and there she is laying on the doorstep, and you can imagine probably what she looks like, right? Gang rape, abuse, whole 9 yards, laying there. And he says to her, right, callously, "Why are you still asleep? It's time for us to get going. You haven't packed the baggage yet. We need to go. Come on, move." Notice what's happened here. If we go with the analogy of the Levite as representing unfaithful Israel and the concubine as representing God, notice what's happened in this story. The concubine has become a sacrifice to save the Levite. The concubine, who represents God, has become a sacrifice or a substitute to save the Levite. Shades of Good Friday, right? I'll say more about that in just a minute. Then, as if all this weren't enough, the Levite takes the dead concubine and cuts her in 12 pieces and sends one piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel to let them know what has happened. This causes great scandal among the people. They're really angry, and they call the Levite to come testify. And here I'll do a little bit of summarization just for the sake of time. And there's kind of like something of a trial to find out what happened, kind of a judicial inquiry. And the Levite, of course, is called to testify. And his testimony that he offers, and once again, we want to remember, right? Remember, "You shall not bear false witness" applies to, remember, primarily giving testimony in court. And what happens is, when the Levite is put on the stand and he's asked what happens, he basically lies through his teeth about what happened. He omits certain important parts of the story. The most important part that's omitted was he neglects to mention that when the angry mob came to do him harm, he pushed her out among them. In his telling, the mob grabbed her and pulled her away from him, and he was sort of like an innocent bystander. And of course, that's totally false. He's guilty. He refuses, though, to accept it, and he refuses to own responsibility for it. Well, what happens, of course, is, as you might imagine, is civil war. The 11 tribes of Israel get together and they wage war against the tribe of Benjamin. So notice the storyline now, right? Unfaithful Israel, faithful God, abuse, violence, and now civil war, in which the people of Israel are not fighting Canaanites, they're fighting among themselves. This is sort of like, the next level of descent into darkness and lawlessness and covenant breaking. Now, an interesting thing happens in Judges 20:26, and then after this, I'll read the conclusion of the story. "Then all the people of Israel, the whole army, went up and came to Bethel and wept. They sat there before the Lord and fasted that day until evening and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the covenant of God was there in those days. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days, saying, "Shall we go out once more to battle against our brothers and the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease?" And the Lord said, "Go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand." Now Phinehas here represents the opposite of the Levite, right? The Levite has kind of hired himself out to basically minister in a pagan shrine. He's kind of been like a family minister who has served this pagan shrine. He's basically interested in a comfortable living and doesn't really seem to be caring what's actually going on in that service. Phinehas is the opposite. Phinehas knows that something's wrong. He knows what the people of Israel want to do. But he says, okay, look, folks, before we do anything, we need to do two things first. First, we need to worship God. And second, we need to inquire of God whether he wants us to do this or not. This is basically the first time in the book of Judges we've heard anything like this. Okay, all of the book of Judges, right? It's been, okay, well, this is what we want. Or, you consult the paid house priest, and he whatever you suggest him, he thinks that's great. This Phinehas is the first person who has finally stood up and said, whoa, wait. We need to focus our lives on the genuine worship of God. And before we embark on anything, we really need to consult him first. And so Phinehas is kind of like a light in the darkness in this story. Well, to bring this kind of sad story to a conclusion, what happens is that the 11 tribes actually do end up waging war on Benjamin. And they get to the point where the tribe of Benjamin is facing extinction. And that's when they draw back. That is, they realize that they can't eliminate one of the 12 tribes. And so they kind of bring the war to a screeching halt. And then the question comes up, well, wait a minute. The tribe of Benjamin has been radically reduced. How are they going to build back? They're going to need wives to do this. And where are we going to get wives for them? And that's how the story ends. So here's the end of the story in Judges 21, 16 and following. This is kind of another dark moment in the story. Then the elders of the congregation said, "What shall we do for wives for those who are left, since women are destroyed out of Benjamin?" And they said, "There must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that the tribe may not be blotted out from Israel. Yet we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the people of Israel had sworn, 'Cursed is he who gives a wife to Benjamin.' So they said, 'Behold, there is a yearly feast of the Lord at Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebonah.' And they commanded the people of Benjamin, saying, 'Go and lie in ambush in the vineyards, and watch. If the daughters of Shiloh come out to dance in the dances, then come out of the vineyards and snatch each man his wife from the daughters of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. And when their fathers, their brothers come to complain to us, we will say to them, Grant graciously to us, because we did not take for each man of them his wife in battle, neither did you give them else, that you would now be guilty.' And the people of Benjamin did so, and took their wives according to their number from the dancers whom they carried off. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and rebuilt the towns and lived in them. And the people of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family, and they went out from there, every tribe to his own inheritance." And then here's the concluding verse. "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." That is, notice the irony of what's going on here. The 11 tribes of Israel rise up in righteous indignation over what's happened in Benjamin. That this concubine was raped and then dismembered, so they think, and the pieces were distributed. So they attack Benjamin to sort of like punish Benjamin and sort of like in a kind of fit of like righteous indignation. To right the wrong of what was done to this one woman, however, they basically abduct 400 women forcibly and take them back to their homes. And I think that's intended to be sort of like an illustration, right, of one of the things that's wrong. That is, what happens, I think the Judges is raising this question, right? What happens when there's no sense of accountability to a higher standard than simply what you happen to want or think at this moment? What we've seen in the book of Judges, and we'll spend some time next Sunday kind of reflecting on the book of Judges and then transitioning into Ruth. But I think one of the things we can say for now, right, is here's what happens when God's covenant is disregarded, when God's intentions are ignored, when the law of Moses is simply put aside for what someone happens to want at this moment. The results are not simply that people somehow develop like wrong theologies, although that does happen. The result is not simply that people kind of like, make little mistakes here and there. The result is simply that human life degenerates into a chaos marked by violence, stupidity, greed, blindness, and unfaithfulness. And that kind of picture is like splashed before us in the book of Judges. That is, I think one of the things we really want to appreciate, right, is we want to appreciate kind of maybe going back to that scene, right, in Genesis 6, right before the flood. Remember, there's that really important comment that's offered. God saw the world that he had made, and behold, the earth was full of violence. Violence. That is, I think we're being offered a really, really important kind of insight into kind of the human condition and what's wrong. And that's something like this. It's easy for us, easy for human beings, to get off course. Once again, when we don't have a standard that's like higher than ourselves, higher than something that we've chosen, what will inevitably happen is we will choose our own standards and then we will live by them. And what unfortunately will happen in that kind of situation, right, is that we will find ourselves kind of in a path, in a kind of a downward spiral of kind of degeneration. Another way to think about what's going on here in the book of Judges, and once again I'll have more to say about this next week, is to think about something that Paul says in the first chapter of Romans. Paul in Romans 1, right, remember, kind of offers that kind of description of what sin does in human life. And I think what he says here is important, that we want to kind of think about it. So this is Romans 1, 28 and following. And once again, it's important, right, to see that the claim here right now is not that what Paul says here applies to sort of like everyone, individually, completely. Rather, it's sort of like a picture. This is like if you want to think of it this way, this is a panorama of sin. So here it is. Since then, they did not see fit to acknowledge God. God gave them up to a debased mind to do what they ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetous, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. In Judges, the people of Israel are depicted as foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless because they've broken their covenant with God. Although they know God's righteous decree, and they know that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but approve those who practice them. It is, once again, I want to underline what Paul says here, right? Paul says, right, that one of the things that sin does to us is, as Paul says, right, it gives us what he calls a debased mind. That is, one of the things that sin does in the human mind is it undermines our ability to distinguish between right and wrong, between good and evil. And the more we go down that path, right, what happens is we're able to rationalize whatever it is we happen to be thinking at this moment, right? That is, one of the things that happens to all of us under the power of sin is we acquire the great ability to be like rationalizers, to find really, really good reasons for doing what we already want to do. And the problem with rationalization, right, is that when you're on the rationalization path, right, you are actually sinking deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into a kind of like a morass of darkness. And so by the time we get to the book of Judges, right, there's kind of like a question that's kind of hanging in the air. I think it's a really important question. It's a question that we're not going to see actually answered until the New Testament, and we'll kind of be thinking about that next Sunday as well. But the question that kind of hangs over us as we come to the end of the book of Judges is there a future for the project that God started in his covenant people Israel? Is that project somehow simply destined to run off the rails and to simply blow up? By the time that we reach the end of the book of Judges, the answer to that question almost seems to be, well, unfortunately, yes. This does seem to be like the end. There's not a lot of hope here, and things certainly have run off the rails, and things certainly have blown up. The thing that we're going to remember here is this, and this is what I'll say a little bit about this again next Sunday. The thing that we want to remember, the thing we want to kind of think about here is this. A lot of the way that we think of things depends on the perspective from which we see them. We tend to be schooled to think, right, that what's going on immediately around us, in front of us, is a complete and total indication of reality. And we need to base what we think on that, right? So if you look around and if you see cultural chaos, oh my God, we're in cultural chaos. If you look around and you see church shrinking, you say, oh my God, the church is shrinking. We're doomed. And it goes on and on like that. I think Judges is offering us a warning against doing that. Judges, I think, wants us to switch perspectives. Judges wants us to remember something else, and that's this. That as long as God is God, as long as he's the creator, as long as he actually has made a covenant with humankind, whatever we might see in front of us, whatever is appearing in front of us, shouldn't be taken for the whole story. Because wherever God's involved, there is hope. And we'll see an indication of that hope once we get to the book of Ruth, which I think kind of provides a nice kind of bookend to the book of Judges. So is there hope for this thing called the people of God, which we call both Israel and church? The answer to that question is absolutely. The question is, right, well, where does that hope come from? Here's a hint to the answer. It doesn't come from us. We'll see where it does come from. So what we'll do next Sunday is I'll have a couple of concluding reflections on the book of Judges, and then we'll transition into Ruth and just kind of hint of coming attractions. The book of Ruth is also another one of these books, right, that is on the surface it seems kind of like a neat little story, right? Woman who has these wonderful daughters, and she finds her way back home, and and they all live happily ever after. We'll see as we begin the book of Ruth is that actually there's a lot more to Ruth than that. We'll see that actually the fundamental theme of the book of Ruth is the faithful, merciful, loving kindness of God, and how that can be reflected in the lives of his people. That's a kind of underlying theological theme in the book of Ruth. But hopefully we'll start tackling that next Sunday.